All right. Welcome everybody to the Tableau server or the Tableau user group for public safety. Um, I don't have a whole lot of updates this month. It's been a busy month for us, Oksana and myself both. So we've been sort of out of touch a little bit lately. Hopefully things will settle down the next month and we can get back to doing things between these meetings and sessions. But we have a really good, outstanding speaker, as Oksana would probably say, and Joe Candela. We used to work for the Chicago Police Department. I'm going to shut up though and hand this over to Oksana because she knows him much better and can talk about him and hand it over to him so we can get started on this. But it's all going to be about Tableau server and all the way from setting it up to managing it and doing everything in between. So I'm excited myself to listen to this. I've seen the presentation already as a preview, and there's some pretty exciting stuff in there and some things to really think about if you haven't. So I hope everybody enjoys it. Like I said, we are recording it, so we'll be posting this on the Tableau user group's YouTube channel, and then we'll send out that link at a later point. So I'm going to go ahead and just give it over to Oksana, and I'll monitor the Q&A if there's any for you guys.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Chris. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for coming. Today, I feel it's going to be amazing session. I'm so glad for everybody who was able to make it. I would like to welcome Joe Candela. Joe, again, thank you so much for coming. Joe brings 23 years of law enforcement experience and currently serves as a senior Tableau server administrator at a company called Exact Sciences, and I'm sure he'll share a little bit more about himself in a couple of minutes. But I've had a pleasure and an honor to work with Joe at the Chicago Police Department, where Joe actually was Tableau server administrator also at that time, and he had the number of responsibilities that Joe had. The list was never ending. But for just purposes of today's presentation, he actually deployed, designed, and administered 2 internal Tableau servers and 1 public-facing server. So he has done it all. He, like Joe is going to tell you, he's made all the mistakes. So and he will share some of them today. So you don't need to, you don't need to go through the same. But and so on top of the Tableau server administrations, deploying. Joe also managed a vast data warehouse and the data and connecting all the data to Tableau server that we had at Chicago Police Department with, thousands of tables and millions of rows. So it's really incredible. I truly believe he's one of the top, Tableau server administrators in the country. And it's just so amazing to have this opportunity. I have my pen and and paper. I'll be writing down lots of thoughts and making sure I don't miss anything going forward. But anyway, I'm gonna stop here. Not to run out of time, I would like to welcome Joe. Joe, thank you so much for coming. Turning over to you.
Oksana, thank you. Thank you and Chris for having me. And I think I'm going to hire the 2 of you as image consultants at some point. So maybe we could talk after this, because I hope I live up to the hype. That's an incredibly glowing review. I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to shut off my camera real quick because I'm getting a little, I'm afraid I'm low on bandwidth. So I just want to make sure that nothing happens with the audio here. So a couple quick housekeeping things I want to say. I know we have an hour and a half scheduled. My talk goes about 45 minutes that I'm going to give. And I, for one, don't like hearing the sound of my voice for 45 minutes straight. So feel free to interrupt with questions if you have them. If I go too fast, feel free to, speak up, come off mute, just say, hey, slow down. I missed something. I'm more than happy to have this be more of a back and forth and a dialogue rather than me just, pontificating from up here on high. Although, like I said, I have material to talk about, so it's whatever works best for the group. With that, I will give a quick introduction. As Oksana said, my name is Joe Candela. I was a police officer in the Chicago Police Department Oh, let me give you the agenda real fast. I'm sorry about that. I'll do a quick introduction. We'll talk a little bit about planning a deployment. We'll talk a little bit about organizing a server. And then we'll talk some about maintenance and monitoring. And I want to leave time at the end in case anybody doesn't feel like asking questions in between. I'll leave time at the end so that we can have some question and answer. Again, this is going to be a high-level overview. We don't really have enough time to really dive deep into any of this stuff. But aside from just the question and answer period, I'm also happy we can take this offline. I'm going to give you my phone number and email address. I'm more than happy to answer questions offline, or come back. If they'll have me back, then I can do that too. All right, so introduction. Again, name is Joe Candela, Chicago Police Department for about 23 years, 23 and a half to be exact. I worked in a bunch of different capacities. I obviously started off in patrol. I worked on a tactical team, which was essentially the guys that drove around in unmarked cars wearing jeans and did silly stuff. I worked in the organized crime division as a gang intelligence officer doing long-term surveillance. We did wiretaps. We did physical surveillance, long-term investigation on gang members and gang hierarchies. Ultimately, I became an analyst. Came inside and started doing data analytics for predictive policing program that we were starting up. Became the subject matter expert for some of our databases. Created some of our analytics tools at CPD with our IT folks, and eventually became the Tableau administrator when we adopted Tableau. I retired in October 21 and came to Exact. I've been with Exact ever since as the Tableau administrator. So I tell you that mostly to say that I don't have any formal computer experience. My master's is in criminology. I was not a computer systems engineer, software engineer, any of that. At best, I'm an analyst. At worst, I'm a fraud. And everything I learned on the job. So I say that to say I made a lot of mistakes. If this is something you're looking to do, you don't need any particular experience with it. You can pick it up, and I'm going to give you some of the tools, hopefully, that you can at least start down the road if you need to. So let me tell you our experience at CPD with Tableau Server. Like Oksana said, I'm going to tell you our mistakes so you don't have to make them. Like I said, I was, at the time, I was just an analyst. I was a project manager and an analyst working with some of our academic institutions who were doing research with us. And I came back from vacation. We had been talking about using Tableau for a couple of months. We had some sales meetings, but I come back from vacation, a 2-week vacation, nice and relaxed. And I'm sitting having coffee with one of our crime analysts, and he says, hey, isn't it great that we're going to be using Tableau? I said, yeah, it's, you know, I'm really looking forward to it. We'll see if we're going to buy it at some point. He says, oh, no, we bought it. We're going to start using it today. I said, oh, I wasn't aware. So, of course, I go into my captain's office, knock on the door. So, listen, I was just talking to an analyst, says we're going to be using Tableau. He says, oh, yeah, Joe, you know, I was going to stop by your desk and talk to you. Yeah, we bought it. We're actually going to start up a Tableau server. So we're going to need you to spin up a server for us. Okay. I said, you know, I could do that. I don't know much about it, but I'm happy to do that. You know, what's our timeline? Next month? I said, no, we have a meeting with the command staff at 1 o'clock. We'll need you to have it done by then. I said, that, you know, it's like 9 o'clock in the morning. Gives me a couple of hours of spin it up. I don't know anything about it. She says, oh, no, it's no problem. You can, it's just an installer package. We talked to one of our consultants. You know, you just double click the executable. It does everything for you. It's going to start up the server, no problem. So let's talk about a little bit of planning a deployment, shall we? Okay. First off, have a plan. And I know it sounds stupid, but it's that important. We didn't have a plan. That story I'm telling you is 100% true. I didn't make any of that up. I didn't change anything. That is exactly how we deployed Tableau Server. 9 o'clock in the morning, I found out we had to have it up by 1 o'clock. And we got it started by 1 o'clock. It wasn't very good, but it was going. So I'm telling you, don't do that. Have a plan. And that plan doesn't have to be anything intricate. It could start with just asking yourself a couple of questions. Why are we doing this? Right? How does this fit into our existing priorities? What are we doing? What do we actually need the server to do? Right? And who's our audience? Just a couple of questions like that. Because the answers to those questions are going to, in large part, determine how you go about organizing your server, some of the processes that you buy with your server. We just bought a bunch of stuff, threw it at the wall, and saw what stuck. That is not the way to do a deployment, okay? I'm going to show you as we talk a little bit. The answers to these questions are really going to determine how you take these next steps, okay? I have on here, go slow. You know, there's a saying, I think it's from the military. I have no proof, but slow is smooth, smooth is fast. And that's actually something I say to myself all the time. Had we just slowed down and not rushed to deploy a server just to have a server up, things would have gone a lot better. We went fast. We made a lot of mistakes. Things broke a lot. And we spent more time fixing things than we would have just planning on the front end and going forward. Okay, so go slow. Take your time with it. It's not complicated, but you can make it complicated if you try and go too fast. Set your expectations early. Another mistake we made, we didn't get everyone all on the same page. Get all of your stakeholders together if you can. And again, figure out who your audience is going to be. Get them all together and see what they need. Okay, we wound up doing something and people were pulling in multiple different directions. And we spent a lot of time doing and redoing things because not everybody was on the same page. And let me be clear, this is all prior to Oksana getting on board. So none of this has anything to do with her. By the time she got there, they had everything running real well. So we always appreciated Oksana for helping us get everything right. The last thing I'll tell you about.
Thank you so much, Joe. But this story is like, it's I'm loving it. You know, this is I think this is just shows on one hand how great the Tableau server is, right? Like, because you can just launch it. You know that it's very user friendly. But something is a great advice to go slow and really plan before deploying it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it'll run. You know, you'll have a server. Might not be the one you want, and it might not be useful, right? But you'll have it. And that kind of goes along with that last point. There's no one right way, okay? How you set up this server, I'm not going to be able to sit here and talk to you and tell you the exact way you're going to set up your server and it's going to work for everybody. It's going to depend a lot on the answers to those questions you're going to ask. And it can morph as you go along. Okay, sometimes your priorities are going to change, and that's fine. You know, the server is actually very adaptable, and you can configure it in different ways to solve different problems. Okay, so there is no one right way. All right, that is a very high level view of planning. Tableau actually has a thing called Tableau Blueprint that I will provide some links to and some directions for that actually helps you go through this entire process. Gives you some of the questions to ask, tries to sort of figure out what it is you need, how much you should buy. That takes a while, okay? This is not a quick process, and we can't really dive into everything, but that's kind of a high-level overview. Are there any specific questions before I move on? Okay, silence is golden. We will go the right way and talk a little bit about organization, okay? So you planned out your deployment. You know generally what you want to do. How are you going to organize things so that it works for you? Okay. First, I want to start with some vocabulary, only because I'm going to be using these words, and these words have very specific meanings in the context of Tableau server. And sometimes it gets confusing because people use terms interchangeably, but for the purposes of our discussion, they're very, very specific in what they mean. Okay. So obviously at the top, you have Tableau server. Tableau server is the application. It is the machine. It is what is actually making everything possible. Okay. I like to use the analogy of it being like the building. Okay. It's your house. It's the house that has everything in it that you need and everything coming in it that you need to make your life easier. Okay. You have gas, electric, phone, internet, all of that coming in. These are all different conduits, just like the server has everything coming in, right? It's got different data streams. It's got different processes that are running, all to make the rest of this work better. Okay. Within the server, you can have multiple sites. Sites are like the rooms in your building. Okay. So your building, you have to have a way to get access to it. You have a key. Server has URL that you would use to get to. Sites are the same way. Sites are like the rooms in your house where you have a key to each particular room. Okay. Sites are completely partitioned off, and we'll get into more detail about that later. But sites are completely separate containers within your server. Then within your site, you can have individual projects. Projects, some people also call them folders because that's what they look like on the server, and they're basically the same experience like Windows Explorer or Mac OS. They're all the folders that are in your file system. Okay. In my analogy, they're like the file cabinets in the room. Okay. Again, you have access points. You would have keys to the file cabinet so that only certain people could get into certain file cabinets. Projects are the same way. Within projects is where you're going to find all of your content. Okay. No content is going to sit on a server or a site bare. It's always going to be within a project, even if it's just the default project that Tableau server creates when you spin up a server. You're always going to have one project. That's just the way it works. Okay. This content is going to be either workbooks or data sources. You can have those two things in your project. You can think of a workbook like a binder, okay, in your file cabinet. The binder is going to contain all of the stuff that your users are going to wind up interacting with. And underneath there in blue, you'll see I actually have the hierarchy different. The lowest level are your views that you're probably all familiar with, that I'm sure Oksana has given talks about. Views are the individual pages that contain content, right? So it's going to contain, each view is going to contain either a chart or a crosstab or a list, one specific element that you're going to work with. Put multiple elements, multiple views together to create a dashboard, right? You have a dashboard with, that has 4 pages, 4 views, each, 4 different charts or 3 charts and a crosstab. And then you would combine multiple dashboards into stories to tell a story. Okay. Any questions on that before I move on? Because those words are important for the rest of this. Okay. So organization at a high level. This kind of goes back to knowing who your audience is. Okay. As you're going to see when I start talking about permissioning, knowing who your audience is very much going to show you how you want to organize your server. There are 2 main ways you can organize your server. They're not mutually exclusive, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the 2 main ways are you can organize it using sites, you can organize it using projects. Okay. Like I said before, the sites are nice because they are fully contained. They're canisters that don't interact. They keep your audiences completely separate. Okay. So one of the questions you need to answer when you're planning is, how important is a completely clean separation to me? Do I need to make sure that users don't have access across different things? If the answer is yes, you might want to set up multiple sites, okay? Because there's absolutely no chance of cross-contamination. Your audiences are separate. You're maintaining completely separate user groups, user lists, let's call them, and completely separate identity stores. So your sites are going to be completely separate. And I'll show you a little bit more on that. The other possibility for organizing content is with projects or those folders, okay? And again, you can still maintain access control via projects. You can set different permissions per user per project. However, all of your users potentially have access to that, right? So I, as an administrator, if I make a small mistake and I'm accidentally select 2 projects and give Joe Smith access to both, and he was only supposed to get access to 1. Now he has access to both because I wasn't quite paying attention. That's a lot harder to do on a site where Joe Smith wouldn't even be a member. The nice thing about projects is you can change projects. It's just like with Microsoft, File Explorer. You can delete a project, delete a folder. You can rename projects. You can move projects around. It doesn't take much effort. Where with a site, it's a little more complicated. You have to do some things where you actually completely destroy the site, rebuild it, you have to bring new users in, rebuild your user list. Not impossible, but more difficult. And with sites, it's also more difficult to manage those users, right? Because you're maintaining manually separate user lists for each individual site. So it makes it a little more complicated. From a user experience, it's also a little more complicated because users can't just go from site to site the way they would from project to project, right? You can click into a folder and out of a folder in the same session. You can navigate without a problem. If you have a user that's a member of 2 different sites, they actually have to log out of the first site and log into the second site in order to use anything. Okay, so it's a little more difficult. This is an example of a hybrid approach to a server. So you'll see the server on top. The server's partitioned into 3 different sites. Okay, this is a hypothetical, and it's sort of what we used in CPD. Okay, your 3 sites might be internal affairs, your office of the chief, and then everything else. The nice thing about this setup is internal affairs being its own site. Obviously, internal affairs is probably going to have some confidential information you don't want, Joe Patrolman to see. So internal affairs only has users assigned to internal affairs that can access that site. There's absolutely no chance that Joe could ever get into one of the internal affairs projects or workbooks because they're not even a member of that site. So internal affairs is completely separate. Same thing with office of the chief, right? Maybe you only want the chief to be able to see high level important information. So you have a completely separate site there. And then you can put everyone else in this 3rd site. Okay. And in this 3rd site, I'll zoom in. This 3rd site, you might break down into your different patrols, right? So you have patrol north, a patrol south, and a traffic unit so everyone has access to the site, but only officers assigned to districts in the north can see information in the patrol north. You have to be assigned to patrol district and patrol south to see any of the content in that project. And then you have to be assigned to the traffic unit in order to see any of that content in the traffic unit project. However, we can give the traffic unit officers access to patrol north and patrol south as well. So they would have access to everything, where your beat officers, your regular patrol officers, only have access to content in their specific area. And this is pretty much what we did in CPD, only we had, I think, internal affairs was a separate site from everything else. And then only IAB personnel could get into the internal affairs site. So that's, did you have a question? Did somebody have a question?
Yeah, I have a quick question, Joe.
Sure.
Just going back to that previous slide. I have a question about public facing content. So I know at Chicago Police Department, we had 2 different servers for internal things and external things. But in this case, do you think some agencies can just use separate site for public facing content for their website that, everybody can see?
Yep, that's a great question. And the answer is most likely no. So because Tableau server has to be deployed. It's either going to be inside or outside of your firewall. Okay. So the firewall is what is going to separate the internal network from the external network, any publicly accessible content, right? So you don't want, obviously, anybody from, any Joe citizen being able to access your internal affairs or even your Patrol North projects. So that server is behind a firewall, so that Joe citizen can't ever get to that. So that's great, but it also means that if you do want to make content publicly available, unfortunately, you have to deploy that completely separate server, which is why we did what we did at CPD. You have to have a completely separate server that is installed on a machine outside of your firewall, outside of your internal network, so that it's reachable by the rest of the community, the public. It'd be nice if you could just create a site. It'd be cheaper too.
Thank you. And I wonder if that's, you can deploy Tableau Cloud instead, right? Like you can have both Tableau server on premise. Yep. And then, because I know Tableau Cloud is more also affordable. So I wonder if it's, this is the case where some people can use Tableau Cloud and Tableau server together.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And I'm not sure, because we've just started kind of getting into negotiations about Tableau Cloud. And I know there's a limit on the number of sites you are given at the base level Tableau Cloud, but I'm not sure if they will do, how access rules work.
So Joe, I'm going to jump in real quick. So we, the way we set up our server is it's internal to our network, but we use proxies. So we have a proxy server from the DMZ to allow us to be able to give public content from the server. And of course, then we have our site for officers and things there too, because not all the time are they on the network, VPN'd in. We allow them, to use the Tableau iPad install that they can be, down a legislative session and pull up some things from there. So we've used the proxy server type of concept where everything is internal, and we work through the proxy for our public side, and then we separate sites to allow guest access only to the one site. But we also have policies that there's no PII in our Tableau environment anyway, because we're not using it for that type of a concept. So it's less likely that anything we have on the Tableau environment would not be publicly accessible via Public Information Act request, more than likely. So it's different in that sense. But the proxy setup is nice because you can keep everything internal, have everything connected, not worry about those firewall rules, and then just open up your proxy, which is a good concept. However, there's some limitations to that. Well documented on the Tableau community sites, the help files and everything on proxying your Tableau server, but is a way to keep it out from that publicly facing and behind the firewall.
No, Chris, that's a great call out, and I appreciate that. Yeah, and it comes with its own set of, like you brought up, its own set of caveats, right? With the amount of information that's housed in your internal server, you want to be very, very, very careful.
Yep.
Yeah. No, but I appreciate the input. Any other questions about high-level organization before we move on? Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the data. Oh, go ahead.
So sorry, somebody had a question so you mean to say to have two servers, one for public and one for private use inside the company firewall? I think it was from Alan. I don't know if Joe, you or
yeah,
Chris.
No. So I don't know if I misspoke. No, if you're from what I was referring to was to have a server inside the firewall for internal use, and then have a server outside the firewall for anything that's to be publicly accessible. Now that's not using any of the proxies that Chris brought up. I hope that answers the question. This is what I don't like about not being live and in person. I can't gauge whether or not I've actually gotten the information across.
Yeah, this Alan said perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. All right. So data organization. This is another one. There's two main ways you can do this, but obviously you're probably going to use both, and these aren't mutually exclusive. One is having published data sources, and one is having direct database connections directly to whatever databases you happen to be using. Okay, there's pros and cons for each. CPD, we used a hybrid approach that I'll talk about a little bit. But one of the nice things about using a published data source, which is essentially what you're doing, you're making one connection, you're drawing out whatever data from whatever tables you want in your database. So say you want to draw out your arrests and join it to your properties table. Okay, you can do that one time, make a good join, set up a data set that works for what you want, and then publish that as a data set to Tableau server and make it available for anyone to use. Okay. The nice thing about that is it's a faster connection than using a database connection, because that data is now housed on your server. It's directly accessible, and it's in a format that Tableau created, a proprietary format that makes it very, very fast for workbooks to be able to access. The other nice thing is you won't have to worry about doing multiple data extracts to keep that data fresh. If you have your arrest table saved on as a published data source, it's one connection to your database, and it's refreshing probably once, maybe twice a day, however often you want to do it, as opposed to having maybe 30 workbooks that are all using arrest data, that if you want each of those workbooks to stay current, that's 30 different refreshes that you have to do. And that begins to take up a lot of resources on your server. Okay. However, it also takes up a lot of storage space. Okay. So one of the problems we always had at CPD was we always were running out of storage space because we almost essentially replicated our data warehouse on our Tableau server, which was great. It made things very, very easy, but it ate up a lot of space. So we were constantly having to expand volumes. The other problem, and I think it's still a problem, I haven't actually looked into this in a while, but I'm fairly certain it's still a problem, is it does pigeonhole whoever's using that data. Once you create that data set and publish it up to the server, analysts, whoever your creators are, have to use it in that fashion. They can't then join that published data source to another published data source to create a better data set, or join it to some table housed in the database to create something they need. It's an all or nothing kind of affair. So they're stuck with whatever data you're providing them. Okay. On the other side, with database connections, again, direct connection to your databases. The nice thing is you're obviously not using storage space on your server, and it allows for more flexibility for your analysts, right? They can connect to whatever tables you've given them access to. They can make whatever joins, whatever unions they want, create whatever data sets they see fit in their workbook, and publish their workbook up to the server, and they have everything they need and they're happy. Okay, it's very, very flexible that way. However, like I said, it does lead to the problem is every workbook then needs to be refreshed on whatever cadence you feel is important, and you're going to start eating up resources. And those connections can be slower, right? So now it depends on network latency, depends on your database latency, read-write times, all of that. As these refreshes are happening, they take longer. Okay. Like I said, at CPD, we used a hybrid approach. So the nice thing about hybrid is maybe you take your data sources that you know are going to answer 90% of the questions that are going to be asked, which is what we did at CPD. We had a great data governance team that would put together these data sets. So they put together, an arrests, a crimes data source, property data source, vehicle data source, building data source, and published them up to the server. And those were used 90% of the time. And then the analysts also had access to some of the tables in the database. So then they did have the ability to make some of their own. If they had one-off or ad hoc queries that they needed to do, they could still connect to the database and do those things. So the hybrid approach is really a lot more powerful than using an either or for this. Again, it's all going to depend on your use cases, and it's going to depend on what resources you have available to you. If you have a ton of storage, hey, maybe you want to replicate your data warehouse in Tableau server. That's fine. That's up to you. You'll make it a lot easier. It'll make it faster. But again, you're going to be paying for a ton of storage. Any questions about data organization? We'll go into a little more depth, but any questions here?
Joe, I don't see anything, but I wanted to just point out one thing that is on the roadmap that was discussed at TC24 this year, what Tableau is calling composable data sources. And that is to allow published data sources to be joined. Yeah. So it will soon, I don't remember the roadmap and which quarter it was, but they did announce this and showed it off that a published data source can then be pretty much extended, which was a limitation, like you said, with putting a published data source out there, you do pigeonhole the analyst, but this will allow those published data sources now to be a single source. So if you change something in one of the published data sources, it will actually take effect through that join and sync with all the places that are using it. So I see this as a game changer when we get to it, because you can have a very small data set that's a published data source and then extend that. And anytime there's changes in that small data source, it replicates or, just propagates out to anything that's connected to it. So huge change. I think there's going to be a big plus for published data sources that we didn't have.
Yeah, I agree that it's going to be a game changer. The only problem I have with what you just said is, where else that was talked about? TC23.
Right.
TC22, and you know what I mean. They've been saying. I think there's a feature request that goes back to like 2014 or something. But I hope you're right. I hope the roadmap stays true and they do.
Fingers crossed.
They've been talking about it forever. Yeah. Seriously, because it's been a major limitation for a very long time.
I also would like to point something, just in case we have people who are not as familiar with Tableau here, is that when we talk about creating these data sources, we're talking about using Tableau Prep a lot of times. So when you purchase your Tableau Creator license, right, licenses, they come with Tableau Desktop, where you build the reports, dashboards, and then also Tableau Prep, right, your kind of tool that you can use to build these data sources, combine those various tables from your data warehouses to put them together.
Yep, and that's a great call out. And I'm not going to cover anything with Tableau Prep because you have Oksana here that can go in depth, as she is an expert in all things Tableau Desktop and Tableau Prep. But yeah, that's what you're going to be using.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have anything else in the chat or anything, Oksana, or should I move on?
I think we're good to go.
Okay. All right, moving on. If I can use technology and actually hit a button. The last thing about organization I want to talk about is security organization. And again, I want to reiterate that this is a very, very shallow kind of coverage of security and permissioning. There is a lot more information out there, and I'll provide you some resources. And again, I'm happy to go into more depth offline, but due to time limitations, we're just going to kind of briefly cover some of the major things in security. Again, there are two main ways that security can be handled on the server. There's individual level security, which is obviously per user, and then there's group level security. Okay. I'm going to start with groups because, like I have on here, you should really use groups whenever you can. Groups security makes life a lot easier for you as an administrator, because it takes a lot of the workload off of you, not having to deal with setting up individual user permissions for every workbook. And if you have a lot of workbooks, it gets tiring in a hurry. So the nice thing about group security is you can set it up however you like. So you can set up groups by ranks, by your organization structure, like I mentioned before, by, you know, who's in patrol, who's in different districts, who's in a traffic unit, who's on SWAT, who's in IAD. You can do all of that in groups. Okay, it's going to depend on your use case. But you could set up as many groups as you want. And the nice thing about groups is I'm going to talk a little bit more about when I talk about automation, is it makes user management when people move around your organization a lot easier. Okay. The last thing you want to do is, and I'm actually in this situation a little bit with Exact Sciences, when people get promoted or when they move and actually have to reach out and tell you, hey, Joe Smith is now a sergeant. Can you give him access to all the sergeant stuff? If you have a large organization, that's the last place you want to be. All right. You want to try and make it so that at very least you can move Joe Smith into the sergeant's security group. So at least then once you do that, he automatically has access to all of the content the sergeant should have access to. Ideally, you're going to want to automate that process. And I'll talk about that a little later. But that is your gold standard, to try and get everything automated so you don't have to worry about doing it individually. Okay. You are probably still going to need to use some individual level security. And that includes the way users interact. So when you bring users into Tableau Server, if you're familiar, if you've done it before, even if you haven't, you have certain licensing structures. Okay. Not every user automatically has the ability to do everything. When a user is brought in, you might have licenses for users to view content. They can see all the dashboards, but they can't download data. Okay, that's called a viewer license. Some users, if you want them to be able to download data as well as view your content, they're going to need an Explorer license. And then you go all the way up to creators, who are people probably like yourselves, who have the ability to actually make content. They can use Tableau Desktop. They can use Tableau Prep. They require a creator license. Those are all user levels on the Tableau server that you're going to need to set individually. Okay. You're going to have individuals that don't fit into a particular mold, right? So you might have, you know, someone who isn't a sworn officer, who's a civilian, and has a very particular use case and a very particular set of things they're going to need access to. You're not going to be able to set a group up for them. So you're going to set those levels, those permissions individually. But you want to keep that as minimal as you possibly can. Trust me, you will lose your mind doing that all the time for everyone. The nice thing about any of these permissions is that they're all cumulative. Okay, so if you have Joe Smith, who is a sergeant, but he's also a crime analyst who works in the 4th district, you can put him in all 3 of those groups: sergeant, crime analyst, 4th district. And he will have access to all of the content each one of those groups provides. So it's not an all or nothing. All of those permissions are cumulative, including his licensing, right? So you might have a creator license so you can make content. Okay, again, that was super brief, high-level overview. Any questions, comments? Security I could talk about for like 3 hours, but I don't think any of you want to put up with that. All right. Then this is what I would consider the bread and butter of the lessons I learned at CPD. Monitoring and maintenance, okay? Once you have everything set up, you've got server deployed, you've got all of your permissioning and your organization set, that's fine. However, things go wrong and you want to make sure that you're in front of the curve, not behind the curve when these things are going wrong. So that all boils down to monitoring and maintenance, okay? It's going to keep you or your administrator sane, and it's going to keep the end users happy. And when the end users are happy, they're not making your life miserable. And that's important, okay? This is the biggest issue we had early on in CPD. Okay, like I said, we built it quickly. It had a lot of problems, and we didn't have anything in place to really monitor those problems. So I just had commanders calling me up and screaming at me that they couldn't get what they needed. That's a bad day. So it took us it took me a long time to learn how to actually set some of this stuff up, to automate some of the maintenance and to put in monitoring that would actually keep me ahead of figuring out the problem, okay? One of the first things that you'll see you have available is something called server admin views that Tableau created. These are dashboards that have been created by Tableau that are provided on the server that you can use to answer pretty much any question that you can think of for the basic operation of the server. And this is a screenshot from our server showing some of the views that are available, some of the dashboards that are available. Some of the important ones that you'll want to make sure you're familiar with is how your extracts are performing, right? So we talked about you might have either published data sources or workbooks that are refreshing the data on some cadence. And you want to make sure that those are operating correctly and efficiently. This is one of the views that you're going to use to monitor that, okay? You can see this is again from our server, so I have the workbook, the extracts redacted in that black box, but that's what would show your workbook names or your published data source names. This is going to tell you how long your refreshes are taking, whether or not they're succeeding or failing, and how long they're taking when they're succeeding or failing. And this is important because you're going to want to look at this and see, well, first off, do I have a bunch of stuff failing? I picked a day that we had all successes, 238 successes, just to make myself look better. But you want to see, do you regularly have things failing? You don't want to figure out why, because that leads to stale data. So you want to get ahead of that. This will help you answer questions as to, well, is it certain times of the day that things are failing? Is it just certain data sources or certain database connections that are failing? This will help you pinpoint what you probably need to do to fix those things, okay? The next most important thing that you're going to want to look at is how long are your views taking to load, okay? This was one of the huge problems that we had early on at CPD because we didn't have any rules for how dashboards were built. And I know Oksana is showing you all the perfect way to build some of these dashboards that are exceptionally efficient, because I know that's what she came into CPD and did for us. But prior to that, it was abysmal. It was the Wild West. We had no rules, so people were just building things that were incredibly inefficient. And this is one of the views that I wish I had used more early on. This will show you how long each dashboard is taking to load, and it'll tell you, is it a certain time of day that it's taking longer to load, or is it just a really inefficient workbook and you need to go yell at somebody and tell them to optimize it, or do you need to pull it down altogether because it's just that bad? This is one of the views that you can use to answer some of those questions. Lastly, we talked about server space and how if you're using published data sources, it can take up a lot of data space. This is one of the views that'll show you if your workbooks or your data sources aren't being used all that often. So if you have a huge data source or a huge workbook with a ton of data and nobody's viewing it, there's no reason to leave it up on the server. Okay, so like in this view of our server, you see that we have one that is 9.3 gigabytes and it hasn't been used since May. Well, there's no reason to be eating up almost 10 gig if nobody's actually viewing the thing. So you're going to want to get rid of that workbook, or at least reach out to the stakeholders or to the creator and say, hey, listen, what are we doing with this thing? Do we really need it? And if not, can we find a different solution so we can free up some of the space? One of the important things for monitoring, and I hope if you're running a server, you've already done this. If you're thinking about running a server, make sure you do this. Make sure that you set up notifications and set them up correctly. This, again, is built into Tableau. It allows for the server to send you health emails so that if anything goes wrong, it will automatically send an email to you or to a group of users or to a distribution list. This is in the Tableau server maintenance UI, and I'm going to send some links with some directions if you're not familiar with this, but this is essentially if you log into, if you start a web session on the machine that your server is running on, you go to localhost 8850, this is what will come up. You want to make sure that you have a SMTP server that you can use in an email address your IT shop can give you. Get this set up because this is vitally important and incredibly helpful to send you information on how the server is operating at a very basic level. You can see this is the events page where you can set thresholds for if drive space is being eaten up. So we have it set, we want to get a warning email if it falls below 20%. We want to get a critical email if it falls below 10%. And I want you to remind us every 60 minutes until we fix it. Okay, so this is something, make sure you get set up so that you're getting those emails. You don't want to, at CPD, I didn't know about this at the first time. We ate up all the space on the server and it completely hosed the server. We couldn't get it to boot up. It shut down. I had to completely rebuild it and I was miserable. So that is a bad day. Okay, you can see I'm running a little long, so I'm kind of speeding up here. Are there any questions about any of that? All right, I will move on to some of the community tools that are available. So whereas those views that I just showed you are built by Tableau, these are tools that are built either by the community or maintained by the community. Okay, so some of them that I mentioned here are Tab Monitor, Custom Server Admin Tools, or Scout. And here's a screenshot of Tabmon, and Tabmon is fantastic. Tabmon is essentially a service that will dump all the performance data of your Tableau server into a Tableau workbook, and it will display it for you. And it will dump all of the performance data. So you can see here that it's pretty much every service that's running on your server, and it will show you a timeline. And you can use this to see when your server might be maxing out. And if you have to go and maybe you have to buy more memory, more cores, hopefully not, or, pick times to change some of your configurations. And I'm going to show you a little bit on how to do that. If you have certain times a day when your extracts are running and you need a little more resources, I'm going to show you how to automate that real quick. But this is a view that's really helpful in trying to figure some of that out. This one I just learned about, Tableau Scout. So this is actually a program developed by the community that will test any workbook and give recommendations on how to optimize and tell you how it's performing. This, no matter how well you get your server tuned, no matter how much work you do, if you have the greatest server on the planet, if you have workbooks that aren't optimized, they're going to look terrible, and it's going to make you look bad. It's going to aggravate your users, who are then going to call and aggravate you. So this is really a great tool that I'm going to start using more, that I wasn't aware of until I actually started putting this presentation together for y'all. But this looks like a great thing to make sure that your workbooks are optimized in a way that will allow for a good user experience and won't tax the resources on your server. Okay. Lastly is something called the server repository. On your server is a database that contains all of the information about how your server is operating, everything that happens on your server. It's a Postgres database, and it contains every bit of information that you could possibly think of. This is a screenshot of some of the settings, and again, I'm going to provide the slide deck to Oksana. She can pass it out and make it available to everyone, so you don't have to furiously write all this down or take screenshots. There is one command that you have to run to enable access to the database, and that's up on the top. You're going to set a password, and then the box is the dialog that you see for Tableau desktop. You connect to it like any other data source, any other database. You point it at your server, whatever machine your server is running on, put in the username and password, and it'll connect, and it will show you all of the information for your server. Here is just two of the workbooks that I use with our server. One is on top is basically just an audit of every event that happens on the server. So, from publications to who's viewing different workbooks, what users are interacting with what, if users are added, removed, any event. And then the one on the bottom is basically a security audit, what users have access to what content. Okay, this is just a way of showing there is a ton of information available in the repository. So I would highly suggest that you get accustomed to using some of the information that's there, because it's invaluable. And I'm going to, again, some of the links that I'm going to provide, there's some documentation to kind of get you started with how to navigate.
And Joe, quick question. So we can use this data, right, to build additional Tableau server dashboards for Tableau server administration. So I know you showed the ones that helped and they're great, but if you're looking for something else, I think there's lots of data, right, that you can use to build additional reports or dashboards.
Exactly. And like I said, that's what I'm showing right here is that, these are some of the data I put together, and we have dashboards, and I use it anytime I get a one-off question from users that, they might ask, what security group had the most usage of, X, Y, or Z. And I can literally just build a dashboard in 4 minutes and have an answer to that question, because I have access to the repository. So that's why I say I highly recommend using it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Joe, before we go further with this, I just wanted to, Alan had a question that came in about if you had any idea how many extract refreshes a Tableau server can handle. Is there a limit to the number of extracts in the refreshes of the extracts?
Yeah, so technically there is no limit. You can have infinite number of refreshes, but it is dependent on your hardware. Okay, so again, there's a deep dive we could do, and again, I'm happy to talk offline about it and answer any questions. But essentially, there's a service called a background, and you are allowed to have 2 backgrounder processes per server CPU core. Okay, so that means you can run 2 extract refreshes at a time per CPU core. So now extrapolate that out. It's going to depend on how many cores you've purchased, is how many backgrounders you can run, is how many refreshes you can do. And that is the eternal struggle. It's a struggle we had at CPD. It's a struggle I have at Exact Sciences, trying to balance the amount of hardware you're throwing money at to how much, you actually are able to do at any given time. So yeah, that's a long rambling way of answering the question with, yes, you could have infinite refreshes if you have infinite money and just keep paying cores. Okay. All right. I will try and do this quickly. Last section of automate, and bonus points to anybody who gets the reference with the picture on the right and actually said automate in the proper tone of voice. Automation is what made life at CPD become bearable toward the end. Again, when we started everything up, we had no monitoring, we had no maintenance, we had no way of really maintaining things in a fashion that kept the users happy until I finally learned how to automate some of this stuff. Okay, so automation is going to make your life a lot easier. Some of it is pretty complicated, but it's all doable. And this is why I started the presentation with, I am not a computer scientist. I'm not a software engineer. I learned all of this on the job. It is possible to learn this if you have zero coding experience. There's a learning curve, but it's possible if you put some time into it. There's a ton of tools. There's between Google, Tableau, and YouTube, you can figure this out. One of the first things that we put together that I always recommend is maintenance and cleanup. Okay, just by the sheer fact of Tableau server running, it is creating garbage. It is creating logs. It is creating temporary files. It is constantly eating up more and more space. So one of the first things I would do, and one of the biggest helps I have found, is something called Tableau Server Housekeeping. It was built by, created by a guy named Jonathan McDonald. And again, I'm going to give you links to this. It's a series of scripts that you can put on the server to run. We have them run once a week to basically clean up the server and make sure that you're not running out of storage space. It gets all the logs together, zips them up, and then deletes anything it doesn't need, deletes any of the temporary files that aren't needed. And it creates a server backup on a schedule so that you always have an image of your server available should something catastrophic happen. That's something you want to make sure you have, and you have several copies of. We keep one copy on the server and one copy off site just in case. Okay. Another really useful thing to automate is, I talked about using the security groups for users, user onboarding and changeover. If you can get that automated, that is going to take, I don't know, 60 to 70% of the workload off of you, is what I've found. A lot of it is user maintenance. If you use Active Directory or LDAP, I would highly suggest working with your IT department to try and line up some Active Directory groups that you can then mirror in Tableau Server. And you can connect Tableau Server so that it automatically syncs Active Directory groups. And that's part of what I was talking about, if Joe Smith gets promoted from patrolman to sergeant. If you can work with your IT shop to have those AD groups automatically get updated so that Joe Smith automatically goes into a new sergeant Active Directory group when human resources, passes word that he's been promoted, your Tableau server will automatically sync to that, automatically grab that record, put Joe Smith into the sergeant's security group, and you didn't have to do a thing. You don't have to lift a finger. That's what you really want to get to. Another part that you really want to automate is something called dynamic topology, right? So I think 99% of us are in a situation where your data is probably refreshed on a regular schedule, right? And I mean your databases data. Usually early morning, right? 3, 4, 5, 6 in the morning is when all of those databases, all your tables are refreshed. Well, you're going to want your workbooks to be refreshed or your public data sources to be refreshed in a similar fashion. So you're going to find yourself between, 5 and 9 a.m. with high demand for refreshes. And I talked about those backgrounder processes. You're going to be using up a lot of those. Well, With dynamic topology, you can write a script, and again, I can give you a link to it, where it will automatically, at 5 o'clock in the morning, launch more backgrounder processes, take away some of the VizQL processes, and the VizQL processes are what actually are used to serve content to your users. So when somebody clicks on a dashboard, it's the VizQL process that is actually doing the work to actually provide the view of the dashboard to the user. So at 5 o'clock in the morning, you probably don't have many users interacting with your dashboards. So you dump those VizQL processes, create more backgrounder processes, and now you have enough processes to do all of your extract refreshes. Now at 9 o'clock, when your users are coming online and they want to all see their dashboards and your refreshes are done, you can scale back the number of background processes, load up more VizQL processes, and now those can serve up the content to your users. This helps because the other possibility without this is to just be buying more and more cores so that you can keep 10 backgrounders and 5 VizQL processes up at all times, even though they're not being used. And that's just silly. So if you can use dynamic topology to kind of sort out and keep processes used for when you need them, that's the best way to go. Lastly, I have in here REST API and webhooks. You can, these are a little more complicated, but they're totally worth it. Well, the nice thing about the REST API is you can automate the way in which content is manipulated. And what I mean by that is you can automate publications. You can automate user management. You can automate how permissions are set. Rather than doing it manually, clicking through the Tableau UI, you can set up scripts so that if, I don't know, once a month you need to publish a bunch of workbooks or republish a bunch of workbooks, you can write a script to leverage the REST API to actually do all of that publication for you without you having to do it manually. Webhooks are a great way to automatically get notifications pushed to you. So much like what we talked about with those email notifications that Tableau Server has, Tableau Server only has those email notifications for certain server health events natively built in. You can use webhooks to set up notifications for other things that you might be interested in. For example, if you want to know anytime an analyst publishes a piece of content, you can set up a webhook so that when that event occurs, a publication occurs, you automatically get a message sent either via email or to a Teams channel or to a Slack channel notifying you, hey, John Doe just published a workbook. Here's the name of the workbook. And you can click on it. Maybe you can, maybe you need to go review it. That would be automated for you. And again, I will provide more information. There's links available for you to learn a little bit more about webhooks, and I'm happy to answer questions about it offline. 2 quick bonus tips. I'm not one who loves to spend money on things, but one of the things I love is premium support through Tableau. If you have the budget for it, I highly recommend it. It's been invaluable. It was invaluable to us at CPD. We had it, and it's been invaluable to me at Exact Sciences. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the recent CrowdStrike issue, but we had our servers completely hosed, and technical support was awesome, and they were incredibly helpful. I don't know what we would have done without them. At CPD, we actually had a technical account manager sit with us for 2 days when we were having network issues. They actually sent them out to sit on site and help us fix a server. I have on there, at least make a friend. I mean, if you go to any of the Tableau conferences or even these user groups, if you can find somebody who knows something about server, and you can just reach out to them and start a relationship where you can email them. Maybe that's me, hint, hint. Do that. I've made friends at Tableau conferences. A couple I still talk to. I can email at any time. Hey, I just had this problem with server. Have you ever had this problem? What advice can you give me? The other thing I'd recommend is Tableau Server Admin certification. Again, if it's in your budget, it's pricey. But that was another one. Had we known in the beginning, when we first spun up the server, that this was available, the certification, it would have made my life a lot easier. I remember we took it, I don't know, a year and a half, maybe 2 years after we had started with Tableau Server. And I remember sitting in the class, just shaking my head going, had I known all of this stuff, I wouldn't have lost, most of my hair. Okay. And again, I'm going to provide the slide deck, but here are some links, general training. I gave you the link for the Tableau blueprint, the administrator guide. If you have trouble sleeping, it's 1,800 pages. You're welcome to print it out and thumb through it at some point. It does have good information. There's a link to all the Tableau knowledge base articles, which are fairly helpful. A little difficult to search and navigate through, but if you know what you're looking for, it's not bad. There's a link to the certification class. Most importantly on here, Mark Wu. Oksana was nice enough to say I'm one of the best server admins in the country. I think she's wrong, but this guy is number one. He knows everything about server. He gives webinars all the time. He has a web page just full of information. So I would definitely go there, check him out. Anything you need, any question you have, he's probably answered. Lastly, here's some resources about scripting, some of the maintenance scripts that I mentioned, and then some reference materials for some of the other repository, the TSM commands, and the REST APIs that I was talking about. And I ran way longer than I meant to, so I'm going to shut up now and listen to any questions or complaints that you have.
Great, Joe. I appreciate it. I will. I'll take it from here, I guess. So, the one complaint I have is that we only have an hour and a half. I'm sure there's more that we could be discussing, and maybe we can break this down even further and get into more detail. If people would not want that in a future session, I think that would be useful to try to break down now from the high level. You sort of understand what Tableau Server can provide you, and then move forward from there with, okay, what are the sites? What are the differences? Why are the pros and cons? And really get into the security aspect, especially in the field that we're in, making sure that things are done that way and we're not doing things that we shouldn't be, or putting things out there that shouldn't be out there. But there's a ton of content, a lot of things about Tableau Server alone to just dive into even further. So I appreciate the high level but concise and very detailed overview of Tableau Server and from A to Z, essentially, right, to get started. So I hope it's piqued some interest. I hope individuals have gotten a lot out of this. We can certainly, take some feedback on what you would like to see or hear about more on the Tableau Server side. I know we've typically done a lot on Tableau Desktop, and maybe Tableau Prep will be something that we look into because it looks like there's some interest there, and people don't even know about Tableau Prep as much. So we could definitely dive in. But I think with what Joe's done, it definitely piques some interest, especially if we're running on-prem, right? It's a different beast than taking their Tableau cloud environment. You become responsible for all that, especially when you're talking about space and resources and the power for the systems and all these extracts that we do. I'm super interested in the dynamic topology. And the one question that I would have about that, just to start this off, if nobody else has anything to ask, does that require a server restart that would take it down for that time that it needs to restart to bring back those processes online?
Yeah, good question. And no, absolutely not. That's the beautiful part about it. It's completely hot swappable. So when as those processes are spinning up, as soon as they're available, they'll be put into use. The other nice thing is, you might be nervous, like I said, when you pull those background processes down and kill some of them. The nice thing is, yes, Tableau Server will kill those processes, but if one of them is in the process of running an extract, it doesn't kill that refresh. So it will still continue to run even though it's taking away some of those resources.
Right. Yeah, it's almost like a network load balancing and things like that, where it'll trickle down until it has the no connections and then make it unavailable. So it's good to know and good to hear. So when you start having a lot more extracts and a lot more background processes running, you can sort of swap that and use it when you need to, which is good.
Yeah.
All right. Anybody else have anything? I know we had some questions we'd answered. Is there anything else from the group before we let you guys go?
Yeah, I had a quick question. I wanted to jump in. If that's okay.
Sure, Pete.
So I'm with Albuquerque Police Department. I am one of our server administrators. We have some challenges with securing content, especially amongst different categories of creators. And sort of one of the issues we run into is that you have one service account for your Tableau server, and that Tableau service account can see whatever you give it access to. And that kind of creates this interesting backdoor for anyone with a creator who can open up a prep flow or a workbook within the server environment to then be able to see the resources that the service account can see. Right. So we haven't quite figured out the way around it other than creating categories of content creators that can or cannot have the ability to make new resources on the server. I'm just wondering if you found any solutions I would love that 3-hour talk on securing the server, because that's where we spend a lot of time. But I don't know. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you've sort of dealt with some of those issues around creators and their differences. Particularly it has to do with IA data is where we run into it. And I saw that the infrastructure you'd set up has IA as a separate site, which would solve the issue. If we did that, it just would make my life kind of more painful to try to run two sites with, the different sources. So I don't know. I was just wanting you to riff on that, see what you thought.
Yeah. And again, I am happy to talk about it offline too, if we run out of time here. But so the first thing I would say is, you feel like it would make your life harder if you set up two sites. It's really not much more difficult, right? Once you get that site spun up and organized the way you want it, for the most part, like our IA site, I could touch it maybe once a month, really. So it's really not that big a thing, depending on how many users and what your user changeover is, right? That could make it but I would doubt you have, people coming in and out of IA constantly. So just something to think about. I highly recommend using the sites. And then I would throw a question back at you. So I'm not sure I'm following. So is it your content creators have the credentials to the service account and they're using that to make connections in desktop and prep?
If they're opening it through the server. So if they create a workbook on the server then connects to the resources as if it's the service account, not through the user's credentials.
So they're web editing the content? Is that what you're saying?
If they use the web editor.
Really? Okay. So now you're teaching me something. So our use case was always using Tableau Desktop or Tableau Prep on the PC. So if they're using the web editor, yeah, they would be using the service account to make connections. So I guess I would throw it back at you. Why are they using web edit and not Tableau Desktop?
Because once we publish it, all right, I think there's like different preference. It's a preference thing in some cases, but it's also a permissions thing, right? So if I publish a workbook and I want to go make a quick change, right, then they would use the web edit, right, rather than republishing it from their desktop, right? It actually makes changes super easy to just do the web edit. It's a permission. I have a site for somebody outside of the police department. Our oversight board has a site in our Tableau server, and I turned it off, right? They don't get web edit permissions at all because of that issue. So everything they're doing is published from their desktop. So that's the other I think we could do. And the other issue, I mean, it also is related to how we we have our database permissions are all set up through Windows authentication, and we don't have named users within SQL Server. So we're logging in through Windows authentication. So we don't have to create a user in SQL Server every time, which is what Tableau wants you to do.
Yep.
In order to have that with like the virtual connections and things like that. So it doesn't actually pass my credentials, it passes the server's credentials.
Yep. Yeah. So that's the real rub, right? Yeah. That's now that's a lot clearer. I would be, why don't we talk about it? Again, here's my email, here's my phone. Maybe we could come up with something, but that's a lot more complicated especially with the Windows auth.
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey.
Yeah, I don't envy thee. I really don't.
But I do think the separate sites might make the difference, right? Because all of our creators can see some information.
But also at Chicago Police Department, we sometimes just had to.
Nope, you were unmuted, Oksana. Now you're muted.
Sometimes had to tell had to set up some rules like, yes, everybody just will need to use Tableau desktop. It's not that, we have had so many analysts and everybody use Tableau desktops and they made changes quickly and republished. It's not, you know what I mean? Like, it's also something to think about, that sometimes you just have to make this decision. Like, we know we love web edits, but everybody just needs to start using Tableau desktop, like that might be also,
And that's what we do here at Exact. Like I realize that I'm the bottleneck. Nobody's allowed to web edit, and they have to do a publication request through me. But as long as you could be relatively responsive, I don't find it all that difficult. It only takes me a couple minutes to republish something, so I don't usually mind. But something to think about.
All right, thanks.
And anybody else? All right, well, if there's nothing else, I'm going to stop.